This is part 2. Please watch part 1 first.
Previously on Something Horribly Wrong with Peckish Pete. Peter was born in England after his parents immigrated to the country from Barbados. He grew up during the 70s and 80s when corporal punishment was still legal in the UK's education system. But spanking or hitting Peter didn't seem to affect his nature much, unless one were to argue that it only served to make it worse. All throughout his youth and childhood, he displayed a wide range of aggressive and antisocial traits. His desire to control those around him was evident, and it would be an understatement to claim that Mr. Bryan had trouble taking no for an answer. In short, he was violent and manipulative. But when he murdered his co-worker with a hammer in his early adult life, it was clear that there was something horribly wrong with Peter. He tried to kill himself but failed and was arrested by authorities and charged with murder. But ultimately, Peter didn't serve much hard time for the crime. He ended up in a rehabilitation institution for the criminally challenged. After a short stay in the medical facility, they began to reintegrate Mr. Bryan back into society, but before full integration was complete, he was accused of attacking a teenage girl, and it was fairly obvious that Peter was still dangerous. But what he did next went way beyond dangerous, and you're about to discover how he got the nickname Peckish Pete. I'm Mr. Black, and this is the disturbing truth. Other reports suggest that the girl's family and friends actually went to Peter's residence to threaten him. The staff were worried that Peter would be in danger following the incident. In notes recorded by a social worker about what happened, it was stated that following the allegation, and for his own safety, Peter was to be moved out of Riverside House and be sent to the Topaz ward at Newham General Hospital. And due to the victim's reluctance to push the matter further, the whole thing was dropped. I don't know how many strikes that is now, but all these missed swings would lead to a horror the UK wasn't very familiar with. Murderer Peter Bryan was moved to the Topaz ward on the 10th of February 2004. He was admitted as an informal patient. This meant that he had a lot more freedom and could come and go as he pleased. It was made clear to staff that Peter Bryan should be treated as any other informal patient would be. After being admitted, a mental health examination was conducted and the following notes were made.
Peter Bryan was talkative, made good eye contact. His speech was clear, coherent, and communicative. His mood was 6 out of 10, and his affect was euphemic. There was no sign of paranoid or suicidal ideation, and no formal thought disorder, and there were no signs of delusions or hallucinations.
Further on in the assessment under the vulnerability heading, it stated that other people were more of a threat to Peter Bryan's well-being than he was to theirs, which is a complete overcooked crock of shit, served with a side of mashed pathetic. It's just like the Vince Lee Tim McLean case. If you're so sure these monsters won't reoffend, how about you take responsibility for any atrocities they may commit going forward, and you let the offender reside at your house post-release? After all, there's nothing to worry about, and you can afford it. A day after Peter's admission to the Topaz ward, his social worker wrote to the Home Office stating,
"Further to our conversation yesterday, I am writing to inform you that Mr. Bryan was admitted to the Newham Center for Mental Health informally on the 10th of February 2004. This situation arose following an alleged incident of indecent assault on a girl of 17 years old. Mr. Bryan has denied the allegation, but apparently, some friends or relatives of the girl went to the residential home where he lives yesterday to sort him out. Fortunately, Mr. Bryan was not at home at the time. So far the police have not been informed, but we have taken steps to inform the multi-agency public protection team. Following discussions with his responsible medical officer, a decision was made to admit him informally for his own safety. A full risk assessment of Mr. Bryan will be undertaken while he is on the ward. Any indication of risks will be forwarded to you. In light of the above allegation coming to my attention, I intend to put on hold my previous application to move him to low support accommodation. I would also like to take this opportunity to seek permission to move Peter to another appropriate residential home that offers 24-hour support before he is discharged from the hospital. I will keep you informed of events as soon as I have more information. Should you require further information on this matter, please do not hesitate to contact me."
On the 17th of February, Peter Bryan left Newham General Hospital and took a bus into Stratford. From there, he went into the Jewson's Builders Merchant Store on Grove Crescent just before 4:30 p.m. and bought the following items: a claw hammer, a Stanley knife, and a screwdriver. Trust me, if you're blind going into this case, no matter what you think you're about to hear, for most of you, this is probably worse. After leaving the store, Peter went to visit a man named Bryan Cherry at his ground floor council apartment in Manning House, Walthamstow. Bryan Cherry was a 45-year-old man described by his sister as a big softy. He'd had a tough life up until that point. He suffered from epilepsy and was unable to work after an accident on his previous job severed his thumb. He was awarded a pitiful $8,000 in compensation to live off of, but as you can imagine, $8,000 only stretches so far. Bryan Cherry had lived with his mother and father for most of his life before moving into his own apartment when his parents were taken into sheltered accommodation. Cherry's brother also described him as
a sweet man. Everyone says he's a sweet man. He was really nice.
Peter Bryan had apparently met Bryan Cherry through a woman named Nicola Newman. Nicola was friends with another resident at Riverside House where Peter had previously been staying. And apparently Nicola Newman wasn't exactly the kind of person you'd want around someone lonely and vulnerable like Bryan Cherry. But nevertheless, Bryan was obsessed with the young girl, even believing that she was his girlfriend. By all accounts, Bryan Cherry would have done anything for Nicola Newman, and she reportedly took advantage of Cherry using what little money he had to feed her drug habit. Nicola and her unidentified friend from Riverside House would go to Bryan Cherry's house most nights to drink and take drugs with him. She would later admit that at this time she was extorting over 100 pounds a week from Bryan Cherry to pay for drugs. She even told the naive, love-struck man that the money was for taxis because she'd been banned from driving. More crocks of shit with different dishes inside. On the evening of the 17th of February, Cherry had just gone to Sainsbury's to buy some alcohol and cigarettes for Nicola and her friend before going back to his apartment alone. He told Nicola he would see her later that evening, but Miss Newman quickly sold the items Bryan gave her and used the money to buy drugs instead. Around 6 p.m., Peter Bryan showed up at Cherry's place. He was immediately let in. After all, Cherry believed he and Peter were friends. About half an hour later, Nicola tried to call Bryan Cherry and score some more money from him, but she didn't get an answer. Desperate for cash, she got a female friend to drive her over to his home. Miss Newman rang the doorbell, but again, there was no answer, but she could hear movement inside, so she knew someone was home. Using a key that Bryan Cherry had given her, she opened the door and let herself into his apartment. She was immediately greeted by the strong smell of disinfectant and a half-naked Peter Bryan carrying a kitchen knife. He was shirtless with his shoes and trousers still on. Startled, Nicola asked Peter what he was doing there and where Mr. Cherry was, but all Peter said was,
Bryan Cherry is dead.
Miss Newman looked into the living room and saw Bryan Cherry lying naked on his back. His right arm had been removed and it was lying next to him.
The disturbing truth will continue in a moment.
As someone who makes true crime content for a living, you'd think that when I'm not producing it, I'd stick on something lighter and fluffier to watch, but to be honest, that couldn't be further from the disturbing truth. I can never get enough true crime content because every case I go over educates me further, giving me a better edge on upcoming cases. That's why I'm proud to have this video sponsored by Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a streaming service that was founded by filmmakers and just so happens to have more true crime documentaries than any other platform like itself. Not only that, but their true crime category contains a bunch of cases that I'd never heard of, with 15 to 20 hours of new, strictly ad-free content added weekly. I doubt you're gonna run out of stuff to watch on Magellan TV. I actually just got through with Jonestown. It's about that evil cult leader who got his followers to drink poison, killing 918 members, over 200 of which were children. It's heartbreaking stuff. And I mean, I'd seen and read plenty about Jonestown, but Magellan TV explored a side of the massacre that I'd never really considered. They also had pictures and footage inside the compound that I'd never seen. Outside of that, I'd recommend Crimes That Made History, Murder in Paradise, which is about the two backpackers that were killed in Thailand, Price of Honor, about honor killings in Texas, And then finally, the last confession of the cannibal. Pretty dark stuff. But remember, it's not just true crime on Magellan TV. They've got packed categories like history, science, space, travel, and more. Magellan TV is simply ad-free documentaries on demand that you can watch anywhere. TV, laptop, tablet, phone, and the app's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, Google Play, and even iOS, so you can take it on the go. Plus, annual memberships are on the low side, costing only $59.88 or $4.99 a month, and that gives you access to over 3,500 hours of quality documentaries. Hey, they're sponsoring me, and I love that. I love their service, so if you want to check them out, Magellan TV are offering the Disturbing Truth followers 1 month absolutely free. All you gotta do is click the link in the description and pinned comment down below.
Welcome back to The Disturbing Truth.
Nicola, trying her damnedest to hold back her fear, told Peter that she'd see him later before hurrying out of the ground floor apartment. Why Peter let her leave? We'll probably never know, but I guess lucky for her, she hit flight mode at the right time. With her friend still waiting in the car outside, Nicola quickly told the driver what she had witnessed. The shocked friend told her to call the police, but Nicola Newman didn't, and authorities weren't notified, at least not right away. Nicola was worried that if she called the police, she'd be arrested for a standing warrant in her name. Instead, she instructed her friend to drive her home, stopping along the way to tell an unidentified male and female what she'd seen. When Nicola got home, she alerted her mom to the scene in Bryan Cherry's home, and that's the person who finally dialed 999. Hey Nicola, way to go, kitten. What a selfish move. 2 police officers were driving nearby when they received the call. They were quickly dispatched to Bryan Cherry's address. The officers were told there was a man in the apartment who'd been seriously assaulted, but at that point, they weren't sure if the victim was dead or alive. When the officers arrived, they forced open the door and stepped into almost complete darkness, coupled by the unbearable smell of disinfectant. The police were quickly met by Peter Bryan. He was still only wearing jeans and shoes, but he was also covered in blood. At first, the cops were confused. They thought Peter Bryan was the man they were there to aid. It was only after Peter told them that the address was not his that real horror started to sink in. The authorities quickly realized that there were no major wounds on Peter Bryan. It seemed as though the blood he was covered in wasn't his own. They instructed Peter not to move and told him to keep his hands where they could see them as they searched the rest of the property. Moments later, they discovered Bryan Cherry's body in the living room. It was in pieces. The 2 arms had been detached at the shoulders. They were laying a short distance from the torso next to a full leg that had been severed around the buttocks. There was also an unfinished deep cut in the other leg, and Bryan Cherry's head had sustained brutal injuries. Next to the body was the hammer, the screwdriver, and the Stanley knife that Peter had purchased just hours before. They too were all covered in Bryan Cherry's blood. Police asked Peter if Bryan Cherry was alive when they got to the apartment, and he calmly told them yes, Cherry was alive. Peter stated,
"He opened the door to me when I knocked."
Police pressed further, asking if he'd been the one to kill Bryan, and Peter replied,
"I did it, yeah. I don't know why I did it."
Peter watched with a smirk on his face as police moved to enter the kitchen, and just before the officers discovered the horror that lay beyond the door, the blood-covered man said,
"I ate his brains with butter. It was very nice."
On the stove in the kitchen was a frying pan. It contained a white substance with a yellow tinge to it that had been cooked. Next to the hob, they found a plastic plate with what appeared to contain hairy flesh. Next to that was an open tub of butter and clover. They should have never let him out. While waiting for backup and a police van, Peter Bryan turned to one of the officers and said,
"I would have done someone else if you hadn't come along. I wanted his soul."
Peter Bryan was taken to Barkingside Police Station when the van arrived, where he was remanded. While in custody, police noticed that Peter was indeed wounded. He had a pretty bad cut on his index finger. When he was asked how he got it, Peter simply replied,
"It's where he bit me."
It was later determined that Bryan Cherry had been struck by the claw hammer a total of 24 times. A pathologist would later conclude that the amputation of Cherry's right leg only stopped because the police showed up. He wasn't finished. Peter Bryan would later reveal in court that,
"I wanted to carry him out bit by bit and get rid of the body. I used a Stanley knife to cut them off and some other kitchen knives, but I had to stamp on them to break the bone."
he went on to say that he was
Comforted by the smell of blood.
He was obviously charged with murder. Peter was interviewed by psychiatrists that determined he was fit enough for them to do so, and because it was determined he was fit enough to be interviewed, he wasn't placed in a hospital but rather sent to Pentonville, a Category B men's prison located in central London, but he didn't last long there. Staff couldn't even enter his cell without a riot shield for fear of being attacked by Peter. He would often violently threaten staff and fellow inmates. He even expressed that he wanted to eat a human nose next and nicknamed himself
Peckish Pete.
With his behavior and mental health worsening, Peter became too much of a risk and was eventually moved to Belmarsh Prison. Later, he ended up out of prison and in Broadmoor Hospital on the 15th of April, 2004. Broadmoor is Britain's and arguably one of the world's most notorious criminal hospitals. Originally called the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, it opened in 1863 and has since housed some of the world's most despicable criminals. Some of those include Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, Ronnie Kray from the Kray Twins, David Copeland, the London Nail Bomber, Robert Napper, the Wimbledon Common Killer, and Robert Maudsley, the pedophile cannibal. Peter Bryan, who was originally kept in solitary, was moved to the general hospital population after appearing to staff that he was settled. But just 10 days after being admitted into Broadmoor, Peter Bryan met Richard Loudwell. Richard Loudwell was a 59-year-old man who was being held at the hospital after being convicted of the manslaughter of Joan Smith by reason of diminished responsibility. Joan was an 82-year-old woman who was found dead in her flat in Rainham on December 2nd of 2002. She'd been sexually assaulted, and her body was covered with burns and bite marks. Richard was arrested the same day they found Joan and was sent to Elmley Prison, then Belmarsh, 4 days later. Finally, on the 15th of January 2004, Loudwell was transferred to Broadmoor. Just after 6 p.m. on Sunday, April 25th of 2004, Peter Bryan entered the dining room at Broadmoor Hospital's Luton ward. Although 9 staff were on duty at the time, this room was currently unattended by any of them. Another strike in this case for sure, but let's be honest. Keeping score here went out the window a long time ago. This game was quite clearly a no-hitter in favor of Peter Bryan. Without warning, Richard Loudwell was pounced on and initially strangled with a trouser cord. Then Peter Bryan began smashing the unconscious man's head against the floor repeatedly. The attack was sustained and went unnoticed by staff for several minutes. Eventually, after hearing the commotion, the pros rushed into the dining room to find Richard lying on the floor, face covered in blood and deep marks around his neck from the cord Peter used to try and wrangle the life out of his fellow Broadmoor resident. But Richard was still alive, and he was rushed into a different kind of hospital, but he would never regain consciousness again. Wait, is this another evil human rat named Richard that was killed by an evil snake in Britain's legal system? Richard Loudwell? Richard Huckle? What an odd coincidence. In Richard Loudwell's case, he contracted bronchopneumonia as a result of the attack and died on June 5th of 2004. You don't have to like Peter Bryan or the fact that he was able to do this, but you don't have to feel bad for Richard Loudwell either. He brutally assaulted and murdered an 82-year-old woman. This was an evil criminal on evil criminal crime. No need for whisker tears, little Miss Kitten. No need to fire up the virtue signal, Catman. I mean, tough titty, but the Richie didn't live a great life, did he? Then let's not paint him in glory like the other Peter Bryan victims that were innocent. On the 15th of March, 2005, Now triple murderer, Peter Bryan pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility and was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences. Before his time at court, a series of interviews later described as Silence of the Lamb style were conducted by psychiatrist Dr. Martin Locke. Peter told Locke when speaking of Richard Loudwell,
"I get these urges, you see. I've had these urges ever since I saw him. He's the bottom of the food chain, old and haggard. He looked like he'd had his innings. I was just waiting for my chance to get at him. I wanted to kill him and eat him. I didn't have much time. If I did, I'd have tried to cook him and eat him. I felt excited when I attacked him. I wanted to shag him when he was alive and also when he was dead. I wanted to cook him, but there was no time, nor was there access to cooking equipment. I considered eating him raw."
When Dr. Locke asked Peter if he believed cannibalism is normal, he replied,
"Of course it's normal. Cannibalism is normal. Arms and legs taste like chicken. Cannibalism has been here for centuries. If I was on the street, I'd go for someone bigger, just for the challenge. The human body is a natural food source and it makes me stronger."
He went on to make threats about other inmates, saying,
"It's something like a ritual. I want to kill 8 people and be known as a serial killer."
Mr. Bryan even had a certain fascination with the schoolgirl murderer Ian Huntley. And what makes it all sicker is the fact that when Peter was younger, he actually taught a cooking class. Then after the cold-blooded murder of Mr. Cherry, Peter would joke about making Ripper-style dishes like Sutcliffe souffle and Yorkshire pudding. Dr. Locke came to the conclusion that Peter was
the most dangerous man I've ever assessed.
Peter Bryan justified his crimes telling psychologists that he cannibalized as a part of a voodoo ritual. He likened it to eating the forbidden fruit. He explained that he had consumed his friend and would have done the same to Richard Loudwell. He thought it would make him invincible. This story showcases the many serious failings of the legal system in the UK. Prosecutor Joffrey would also go on to say,
The case reveals a chilling insight into the mind of a man who has literally developed an appetite for killing. The circumstances of this defendant's offending, the inability of experts to detect when he is at his most dangerous, and his settled desire to cannibalize his victims all combine to make him uniquely dangerous.
Judge Giles Forrester told Peter,
You had the urge not only to kill but also to eat the flesh of your victims. You experienced feelings of power and invincibility. Not only that, but you gained sexual excitement from the act of battering your victims to death. You killed on these last 2 occasions because it gave you a thrill and a feeling of power when you ate flesh. The earlier treatment at the hospital did not cure your disease, and there is no reason to believe a hospital order now will do what it failed to achieve back in 1994. It is clear that you can appear calm and cooperative while harboring bizarre psychotic beliefs.
The judge was right. But how many wrong learns and left turns did it take to come to the conclusion that Peter Bryan should, at very least, be locked up for good? This was avoidable in so many ways. As recommended by the prosecution, Peter Bryan was finally given a whole life sentence. And to this day, he remains a patient at Broadmoor Hospital. After the systematic failings in this case, NHS England would go on to release multiple inquiries into the care of both Peter Bryan and Richard Loudwell. These inquiries began in 2005, and a total of 62 witnesses were interviewed. The NHS and Home Office admitted to seismic screw-ups and made multiple recommendations so that this type of situation never happens again. Of course, a few years later, Richard Huckle happened. Either way, in a statement made during one of the inquiries, it was written,
We also wish to acknowledge the event which gave rise to this inquiry. Although we have of necessity had to concentrate mainly on Peter Bryan in this report, Bryan Cherry must not be forgotten. It seemed as though it was only too easy to forget the man himself in the media frenzy which surrounded his shocking and untimely death. If this report and the recommendations which we suggest can in any way prevent another such tragic event, then we hope that that will be a fitting memorial to a man much loved and missed by his family.
So all good, right? That's the end of the story. And Peter Bryan is right where he needs to be, in a criminal medical center for the rest of his life. Right? Well, chi-bang, chi-bop-bop, wrong. In 2006, Peter Bryan's whole life tariff was overturned by Justice Lord Phillips in the Court of Appeal. Justice Phillips told the court that Judge Forrester had failed in his duty to adequately reflect on Bryan's mental illness. So Peter Bryan brutally murdered 3 people and was given the benefit of the doubt time and time again like it's the downright Christ-like thing to do. And why? Because in layman's terms, the devil made him do it. That devil is mental illness. You know, this is actually really sad. Cases like this and that of Vince Lear would give people an excuse to further stigmatize those living with this kind of disorder. The outcome here stains sufferers of mental illnesses as potential ticking time bombs, with possibly no recourse for their actions, when the truth is, these conditions rarely result in violent symptoms towards others, especially on this level. Not only that, but this allows for every professional that failed the innocent victims in this case to walk away with a clear conscience, because it's mental health, innit? But in my opinion, innocent blood also coats the hands of those said professionals, and responsibility wets the palms of those in a position of authority that could have and should have stopped Peter Bryan a long time ago. But they didn't. And now, a serial-killing, self-confessed cannibal monster who openly intends to repeat his actions and has stated himself that he should be in prison for life may one day be back out on the street, dying for nothing other than to feed. So sleep well, and remember, God's got your back, because the system sure as hell doesn't. In the haunting case of Peter Bryan, I suppose it's easy to aim my blame gun at the professionals and pull the trigger when those professionals aren't staring me in the face and answering me back. And so for that reason, I decided to reach out to Dr. Das from the YouTube channel A Psych for Sore Minds to have a conversation with him about his professional opinion relating to this story. But Dr. Das isn't just the host of a YouTube channel that I love and find very educational, but he's a forensic psychiatrist and expert witness. Dr. Das has professionally assessed hundreds of patients in prisons, securely locked psychiatric wards, and courts all across the UK. And then to top it all off, he used to work at Broadmoor Criminal Hospital itself. Dr. Das, I'm Mr. Black. Welcome to The Disturbing Truth.
This concludes part 2. Part 3 was made available on this channel while you observed this video. Watch it now.